What if the only way to survive winter was to build your house out of a woolly mammoth? What if the difference between freezing to death and staying warm came down to a single needle, thinner than a matchstick, carved from a splinter of bone? And what if your ancestors, thousands of years before anyone invented an oven or a freezer, figured out how to build one anyway, using nothing but frozen ground? You'd think surviving an ice age meant huddling in a cave and hoping for the best. It didn't. It meant engineering. Constant, creative, occasionally insane engineering, invented by people with no metal, no writing, and no way to look up the answer if they got it wrong. Get one of these solutions wrong, and you don't get a second attempt. The winter simply takes you. So let's go through the actual methods. Not myths, not guesses, real evidence, dug out of frozen ground by real researchers. That shows exactly how strange, and exactly how brilliant your ancestors had to be just to make it to spring. Start with the house made of mammoths. At a site called Mezhirich, in what is now Ukraine, archaeologists uncovered something that sounds like it belongs in a fever dream. Entire dwellings built from the bones of woolly mammoths. Not one or two bones used as tools. Whole structures, skulls stacked to form load-bearing walls. Tusks curved and interlocked to create doorways and support beams. Long leg bones arranged in overlapping patterns to anchor everything against brutal winds. Archaeologist Olga Soffer, who spent years studying these Upper Paleolithic sites across Eastern Europe, documented just how deliberate this construction really was. This wasn't people randomly piling up bones they happened to find lying around. The mammoth remains were selected by size and shape, positioned with real structural logic, then most likely covered with hides stretched over the bone framework to seal in warmth. Some of these dwellings date back roughly 15,000 years, built at a time when trees were scarce or non-existent across huge stretches of that landscape. Think about that constraint for a second. No wood, no stone quarries nearby, just endless cold, wind, and the remains of the largest animal your ancestors had ever hunted. So they looked at a mountain of bones and saw a blueprint. Does that sound insane to you? It should. It also means your ancestors were capable of something closer to architecture than survival instinct. They weren't just hiding from the cold. They were building against it. On purpose. With intention. Using the only raw material the Ice Age had left them. Now here's the part almost nobody expects. Shelter alone wasn't enough. You could build the sturdiest mammoth-bone house in the world and still freeze to death inside it, if you didn't solve a much smaller, much stranger problem first. The needle. Not a modern sewing needle. A tiny, painstakingly carved sliver of bone or ivory, with a hole drilled through one end so small it's hard to believe anyone managed it without modern tools. Archaeologist Ian Gilligan, who has spent much of his career studying the deep history of clothing and how it relates to human survival in cold climates, points to something crucial hiding in these tiny objects. An eyed needle isn't just a sharp point. It's the difference between draping loose animal hides over your body, which still lets cold air leak in everywhere, and actually tailoring clothing that fits tightly against the skin. Gilligan's research connects the appearance of these needles, found at sites in Siberia dating back roughly 40,000 years, to a massive leap in how effectively humans could trap body heat. Loose hides are better than nothing. Fitted, layered, sewn clothing is a different category of survival technology entirely. It's the reason your ancestors could push further north, into landscapes so cold that unprotected skin would start losing dangerous amounts of heat within minutes. A needle, one of the smallest tools your ancestors ever made, and arguably one of the ones that mattered most. Here's where it gets even stranger. Because shelter and clothing solve the cold, they don't solve the other problem lurking underneath every single winter. What do you actually eat? For months, when the ground is frozen solid and nothing is growing. This is where things get genuinely wild, and where you get to meet someone who didn't just study the answer. He lived it. Explorer and ethnographer Vilhjalmur Stefansson spent years living among Arctic communities in the early 20th century, eating almost nothing but meat and fat, in quantities that would sound alarming by modern dietary standards. No fruit, no vegetables, no grains, just animal protein and enormous amounts of fat, sometimes rendered down and stored, sometimes eaten raw straight off a fresh kill, to prove it wasn't just survivable, but sustainable. Stefansson later spent an entire year eating nothing but meat under medical observation, specifically to test whether the human body could actually thrive on it long term. It could, and that fat wasn't just fuel. It was, in a very literal sense, insulation from the inside out. A diet loaded with fat generates more metabolic heat during digestion than a diet built around carbohydrates or lean protein alone. Your ancestors weren't eating fat because they were desperate and had no other options, though sometimes they were exactly that desperate. They were eating fat because, on a biological level, it kept them warmer from the inside, in an environment where losing that internal battle meant losing your life. So picture it. No fruit stand, no grain field, just frozen tundra stretching in every direction. And somehow, generation after generation, people figured out that the fattiest parts of an animal weren't the leftovers. They were the prize. Now let's put all three of these pieces together and actually reconstruct what surviving one of these winters looked like in practice. Picture a small group settling in for the season near a frozen river. The first thing they do isn't hunt. It's build. Mammoth skulls, dragged and stacked with careful precision, form the base of a low, curved wall. Tusks interlock overhead to create a doorway strong enough to hold weight. Hides, painstakingly sewn together with narrow-eyed needles threaded through tiny holes, stretch tightly across the bone framework, sealing gaps that would otherwise bleed heat straight out into the wind. Inside, a small fire burns, carefully rationed. Around it, people eat. And what they eat isn't a balanced modern plate. It's fat, marrow cracked from bones, rendered fat stored in hide pouches, dug into pits carved straight into permafrost that functions exactly like a walk-in freezer, keeping meat from spoiling through months when nothing new can be hunted or gathered. Every single piece of this system, the bone architecture, the tailored clothing, the fat-heavy diet, the underground cold storage, depends on every other piece working at the same time. Remove the needle, and the tailored clothing collapses back into leaky, inefficient hides. Remove the fat-heavy diet, and your body can't generate enough internal heat to make full use of that clothing anyway. Remove the mammoth-bone shelter, and none of it matters, because you're dead of exposure before any of the smaller solutions get a chance to help. This is the counterintuitive twist buried inside all of it. None of these methods worked in isolation. Your ancestors weren't solving the cold with one brilliant invention. They were running an entire integrated survival system, developed and refined across thousands of years, where architecture, clothing technology, and nutrition science, though nobody called it that at the time, all had to function together, simultaneously, or the whole thing failed. That's not luck. That's not blind instinct either. That's engineering, built by people with no blueprints, no metal tools, and absolutely no room for a failed prototype. You don't need to build a house from a mammoth skeleton. You'll probably never carve a needle out of bone, but you are, whether you notice it or not, still running on some of the exact same problem-solving instincts your ancestors sharpened against that impossible cold. Notice how you naturally combine multiple small solutions when you're facing a genuinely hard problem instead of betting everything on one fix. The right tool, the right timing, the right resource, used the right way. None of those pieces alone would carry you through, but stacked together, the way your ancestors stacked mammoth bones into a wall, they hold. So here's the reframe worth sitting with. The things that sound like the craziest survival methods in human history. Houses built from the largest animal on the tundra. Needles carved thinner than a matchstick. Diets built almost entirely on fat. Weren't crazy at all once you understand the problem they were solving. They were precisely rational. Every strange choice had a purpose. Every purpose kept someone alive long enough to teach the next generation how to do it again. If your ancestors could turn a mammoth skeleton into a house and a splinter of bone into the technology that let humans survive the coldest environments on Earth, what does that tell you about the problems you've been treating as unsolvable? And if you had nothing but frozen ground, a dead mammoth, and one long, brutal winter ahead of you, what's the first thing you think you'd actually try to build?